I'm Roddy Iglesias. I'm a certified clinical nutritionist, and this is Wake Up America. My colleague Peter McCarthy is not with us today. He's out of town, but he'll be with us next time. So today I have my friend Will of the People, and he has written an extraordinary book. And let's just say hello to Will. Say hello to everyone. Let me just tell you a little bit about how I got to know what Will was up to. He and I were in several long philosophical conversations about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and he was telling me about a book. This is actually a booklet. He's got a larger book, but he sort of shrunk it down and made it very, very easy to read. This is called A Time for a New Tea Party, and we'll tell you how you can get more information on that book later. But Will and I were really talking about health freedom. I was telling him all of the legislative work that I do here in Texas, and also nationally we're working on the health reform, and we were really talking about health freedom, and then it sort of segued into freedom in general. And so what I want to talk to you about today, Will, is let's broaden this picture a little bit and talk about freedom and where it's gone in the United States, what happened, and and basically what happened to our freedom. We're noticing, I mean, that it seems to be disappearing more and more. Mm-hmm. And I also want to talk to you about how it's happened and what we can do about it.
Sure. Well, what happened is that, and I'd like to just make a couple of statements getting into this, is that throughout the history of civilization, we've seen nations rise and fall. There's been a consistent pattern of nations rising and falling, and we've never seen any nation establish that was able to sustain itself in a viable form for a really extended period of time. And what it boils down to is that every time there's been a revolution in human history, the revolutions always get hijacked. And we've been led to believe that in our revolution, the American Revolution, that it was extraordinary and unique. One of the things we've all been told is that our Constitution is the greatest system of governing that's ever been designed. But now that we're into this period of total financial calamity and all the other things that have been happening over the last several years, we're all beginning to realize that our freedoms are being encroached and being squandered. And it's because the American Revolution was also hijacked, but we've all been unaware of how that happened. And getting into what led up to it, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, the most important part of it is the preamble, because that describes the purpose of the American Revolution. And it was to establish freedom, which was defined by Thomas Jefferson, who wrote it, as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. The key phrase that follows that is the most important phrase in the entire document, and that is that we secure our freedom by our consent to the powers of government. Well, when the Constitution was written, that was omitted.
Well, okay, so let me just clarify this. What basically that's saying is that the governed, you and I, mm-hmm. right, have to give our consent to the governing body. In other words,
to the powers.
To the powers of the governing body.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in accordance to our consent, the consent of the governed. So mm-hmm. consent is a very big difference than I think where you're about to go with how the Constitution sort of changed that verbiage a little bit. So,
correct.
Yeah, so
yes.
What happened there?
Well, what happened is that all of us tend to look at the First Amendment as such an important amendment to the Constitution. And I discuss this at length in the book. And what the authors of the Constitution did, and they were Federalists, and unfortunately Jefferson was not a part of the authorship of the Constitution. The author, the person most accredited with being the father of the Constitution, was James Madison. What they did is they wrote the Constitution in two separate parts. They wrote the first part to set up the framework for how our government would be established and the powers of each branch. And supposedly under the guise that they were creating checks and balances. Well, what we see is we do not have very effective checks and balances. And the problem is that our right to consent to the powers of government were omitted from the Constitution. The powers of government are the laws that are enacted and enforced against us. But our right to consent was not included. And we cannot be free if we don't have the right to consent to what government or anybody wants to do to us.
So weren't those words sort of shifted from our right to consent to our right to petition?
That's correct.
Right?
What they
There's
did.
a big difference between petition and consent.
Absolutely.
And it puts really the power where it lies in the people as one who, you cannot do anything without my consent, to putting the power to the governing body and us saying, oh, please, please don't do this, or please do that. We're actually petitioning, so we shift that power from power from the people, power of the people, to power of the elected officials.
Totally.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, they usurp the entire purpose of the American Revolution. The First Amendment describes what we have perceived in our society as 5 different areas of freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to peacefully assemble, and of course they use the language shall not be abridged, which of course these days even our right to peacefully assemble is being abridged. And then the Achilles heel in the Constitution is that they wrote that they would not abridge our right to petition for a redress of grievances. Well, petitioning is nothing but the right to complain. They did not put anything in there about being compelled to respond to a redress of grievances.
So let me just go here with the title of the book is It's Time for a New Tea Party, and I think what was most fascinating, and especially in our conversation, you and I got into lengthy conversations about how the nutrition industry, how the quote-unquote healthcare industry is basically being controlled by big pharma, big food, big corporation.
Correct.
Right? And this is where, this is where our conversation began, because as you know, I have been, fighting diligently against these big monopolizing corporations and monopolizing organizations that want to control people. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the Boston Tea Party.
Watch parts 2 and 3 to this video to learn more about how our right to consent to the laws we live by is the key to waking up the people to rise and unite to take back our country.